two tallest. Economic globalization. Even if people living in Manhattan just thought they were the biggest shadow-casting pieces of real estate downtown.
The first changes came while the city still toiled in the depths of the fiscal crisis. In 1975, the observation deck atop the South Tower was open to the public for the first time, and almost overnight became one of the most popular tourist attractions in the city. 1 year later, on July 4th, 1976, the nation's bicentennial celebration came to a stunning climax in New York Harbor, where thousands of small boats and dozens of tall ships could be seen parading majestically against the breathtaking backdrop of the soaring Twin Towers. That same year, a spectacular rooftop restaurant opened for business on the 106th and 107th floors of the North Tower. Suddenly I knew, the food critic Gail Green wrote, that New York would survive. If money and power and ego could create this extraordinary pleasure and instant landmark, money and power and ego could rescue the city from its ashes.
The observation deck and windows on the world were the two things, in my judgment, that turned the city of New York from looking at the Trade Center as some monster downtown to something that was theirs. They began to adopt it, and it was great. It was so successful that you had to wait 7 months to get a Saturday night reservation there unless you knew somebody. It was incredible. And we were consistently the highest grossing restaurant in the whole world.
These kinds of things give a building a human dimension. One would hope that the building would have a human dimension in its design. That has always been debatable. It's the case of the Trade Center. But events did happen that showed that this could be brought into the city and into the life of the city. Another thing about the Trade Center that changed it was the whole changing character of Lower Manhattan. People began to live downtown, and they rather liked the Trade Center, the big open space. And then the people living in Tribeca, also the people living in Battery Park City, began to see these buildings as an identifiable landmark in their neighborhoods, in their daily lives. You know, you could orient yourself. You knew where you were in relationship to the Trade Center towers.
Now, as the years went on and we reached the period of the 90s with the great boom in financial services businesses needed much more space, and they gradually took over space as the state moved away to other locations, as Port Authority moved some of its functions out and so forth. That stuff was rented commercially.
The Trade Center took nearly a generation to become truly successful. Through the 1980s, the buildings filled up. In the 1990s, they became truly profitable and gained a kind of credibility in the commercial real estate market that had been predicted at the very beginning but not realized for over 20 years.
And it turned out fine. The Trade Center was self-supporting. In fact, when I retired from the Port Authority of New York in 1987, the World Trade Center in New York was making more than $133 million a year, net. So, you know, it worked, and then all those buildings in Lower Manhattan, all the jobs that it created for people.
Even though we thought of them as a failure, I think now, looking back, we can see what they did contribute. First of all, economically, had they not been there in the late 1990s when New York City suddenly boomed practically like no place on the planet, the city needed all 10, 15 million square feet of office space that those buildings provided. If they were not there, so many other companies would have had to go elsewhere. So we had that space. So in a sense, they helped make possible the renaissance of New York in the 1990s.
Now, the reality was that these huge office blocks built for commercial purposes were becoming more and more centers for world trade and world transactions generally. So in a way, the World Trade Center became more and more truly a World Trade Center over time, and by the 1990s, perhaps for the first time, really was worthy of that name. And I'm not sure how far Americans, particularly New Yorkers, quite saw that it was a symbol of economic globalization.
By the 1990s, the New World Order set in motion a half-century before had succeeded in ways no one could have imagined in the years following the end of World War II, or even as the towers themselves had first begun to rise at the very height of the Cold War. In less than 2 decades, the cultural and commercial energies unleashed by the forces of globalization had breached political and ideological barriers around the world, defeating and absorbing many of America's one-time enemies behind the Iron Curtain, linking the economic fortunes of distant nations as never before, setting whole populations and cultures on the move, and sending millions of new immigrants from every corner of the globe flooding into New York City, in numbers that rivaled and with a diversity that far exceeded even that of the great immigration of a century before. No building in New York, or for that matter in the world, symbolized those astonishing transformations more dramatically than the World Trade Center itself, which by the late 1990s had become a microcosm of the new global culture, humming with electronic financial transactions 24 hours a day, and home to a bewilderingly diverse working population that included Sikh computer programmers, Israeli accountants, Turkish engineers, and financial experts from emerging markets in Malaysia, Syria, Uruguay, and Ghana. Numbered among the tall tower's window washers were men who hailed from Poland, Yugoslavia, Albania, Turkey, and Ireland. The 79 employees at Windows on the World included immigrants from 30 different countries.
Well, the United States is the economy that seems to inhale more than it exhales. It inhales capital, it inhales people. The huge increase in flows of capital and people into the United States, which characterized the 1980s and 1990s, undoubtedly created a kind of asymmetry. And so although economically the United States was completely integrated into the world economy, politically it was becoming more and more detached from it. The myths which go right back to the very foundation of the United States about this special providence that exempts the US from the rest of the world's nasty political conflicts. I mean, this proves incredibly tenacious. People are still clinging to this in the 1990s when it's absolutely clear that the US had never been more connected to the rest of the world.
There's more about New York at American Experience Online. See a map of Lower Manhattan through time, access bonus interviews, and World Trade Center questions and answers with a panel of experts. All this and more at PBS Online, pbs.org.